Hi, my name's Katie Gray, coming to you live from Sonatype. Today we're here for a conversation with senior security researcher Ax Sharma, another security researcher Juan Aguirre, and we have developer advocate Steve Poole. Thank you all so much for joining today. Before we dive in, I know the topic of conversation we'll all be discussing today is Springshell. So before we get into it, Ax, do you want to give us a high level overview of currently where we're at, why my Twitter feed's been blowing up for the past 48 hours over Springshell?
Yes, it's been crazy last 48 hours. I don't think anyone got much sleep in the infosec space. See, just to kind of give a quick recap, it all started with a sort of a rumor, right? Somebody, based on one commit that was vastly unrelated to remote code execution, right? Like Springs developers made this commit. It was just deprecating untrusted deserialization. Somebody thought that it was fixing a bug or there was some confusion. That advisory went on a QQ chat, and that led to some half-baked advisories on the internet alleging that Spring has this new Spring Shell vulnerability, but no one had at that time, like early hours of yesterday, nobody had a working POC at that time. And I just want to get this in to make matters worse. There were also like two more, Spring CVs, especially the SPE expression injection one, which is in Spring Cloud Function, that complicated matters a little bit, causing confusion.
So all this has been going on. There's a lot of confusion, all coming from looking at a Twitter and those types of things. So my question is we know a little bit about how it got uncovered, but what's affected?
Absolutely. So the Spring Shell vulnerability has now officially been confirmed in the Spring Beans component, and it's been assigned a CV just today. A few hours ago, an advisory came out as well. I will let Juan kind of go in the remediation details of it either now or later, but I just want to let everyone know that Spring Shell has been confirmed by Spring's maintainers now, and they did release fixed versions.
Before we get into the remediation, though, I just want to talk about how do you know before, even before you go through that phase, is how do you even know if you're affected?
We can go over that a little bit. So initially, there was like a big mess on the internet. So big scandal. Everybody thought, that this is huge. We're all affected. But there are certain conditions that need to apply for you to actually be affected and this to be exploitable in your application. And there's a few. So let's just quickly go over them. JDK9, right? For the Java version you're going to be using in your applications, you're going to need JDK9 or higher. Uh, Although nowadays you should be using, I guess, not 9 or higher. If you're lower, it's about time to update.
Yeah. So that's what's weird is that in this particular instance, if you've been tardy in moving off Java 8, then you're safe. But of course, you're safe from this, but then you'll be vulnerable for all the other ones that are the other vulnerability raging. And of course, we as a community, we've been pushing people for a long time to move off Java 8 and they should go to Java 17. But yes, it's just slightly ironic that if you're an old version, you're not affected by at least one of these vulnerabilities.
Steve, the line's not too clear, but like, could you maybe like go over the untrusted deserialization aspect of this? Because that's, I think you tried a POC as well. I want the readers to, who are not familiar with deserialization. How is that relevant here?
Yeah, so as seems to be the case now with vulnerabilities, they come almost always with the proof of concept. And as we've seen with Log4j and we've seen with these two, they are pretty trivial POC. The effect on both, whether we look at the Spring REPL or we look at the Springshell one, is effectively it's a very simple way for a bad actor to run arbitrary code on your server. One is slightly harder than the other, but the net effect is I can send you a payload that I can use to run any code I want, whether code that's already installed in your system or possibly get installed by software. So in terms of RCEs, it's way up there as being very easy and very dangerous.
Yes, absolutely. Easily exploitable, dangerous, and that's just getting into one of the factors of it. Another thing that we need for this to also be a factor, an exploitable in your applications, is Tomcat, right? You need to be deployed as a Tomcat, and it needs to be deployed as a war.
Right. So what Katie asked, right? Like, how do you know you're vulnerable? That really helps, Steve and Juan. But like, I just wanna, I still am trying to get a clear answer personally. If it's like the real world impacts, are many mainstream applications impacted by this, or is it like you have to be running, I don't know, like an inadequately secure application that can be breached using this?
So I don't think so. I think from what we've seen, it's a vulnerability that's pre-authentication checks. But I would be worthwhile, as we dig in, we'll see just how true that really is. But it does appear to be that. As far as I can see, we have the Java 9 thing. So you have to be on a system that has modularity built in, which ironically is why this thing is available, because the code that's compromised, or the code that's vulnerable, excuse me, made checks as to its operating environment, and it was written before Java modules existed. And unfortunately, the check was very much a sort of inclusive one. So what happened was there was a new capability was enabled by Java 9, and the Spring code didn't disable that capability, so it basically leaked through. So really, all Spring versions are pretty much at risk of this. And so what we said, it's the suggestions are literally to move to the latest of one of the two streams that they're producing. Now, we talked about Tomcat. What's going on here is what the vulnerability is able to do is to redirect Java logging. So Tomcat is a logging system, and what the vulnerability allows you to do is redirect the logging to an arbitrary file on the disk of the machine. And also, at the same time, the contents of the log is exactly what the bad guy wants. So what they managed to do is to write basically a very simple piece of code that runs on the machine using JSPs. So that's another requirement that you have to be vulnerable. You have to have that enabled. And so they write the vulnerable code onto the disk, and then they as a JSP, and now they can then call that from another URL, and that will drive their bad code. So it's slightly convoluted, but if you've got Tomcat, old version of Java, new version of Java, and you've got JSPs running, and you've got Spring, then that's the selection criteria at the very highest level.
Yeah. This is a technique we've seen before with the redirecting of the logging, right to in this case, I guess you can create a web shell or a whole route of other things and get your remote code execution. So that technique has been seen before, right? And they just found a clever way to leverage it here, which from a security perspective,
you said web shell, and I think that's something that's been common in other programming languages, but I think that's the first time, I think, for a long time we've seen that term in the Java space, that ability to basically install your own web shell. Yeah.
Okay, what else? Yours, yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, now that, Steve and Juan have kind of provided us that high-level overview of what is the criteria for you to be, considered maybe vulnerable, what are the steps that people should be looking at to do to help mitigate that risk profile if they are affected?
Yeah. Well, I mean, upgrading to the latest version, like I said, and I do know they released the 5.3.18 today. Keep me honest, Juan, and they backported the fix into 5.2.20. And yeah, please keep an eye on the updated advisory released by VMware. Yeah, the other steps you can take, there is also workaround provided by Praetorian as one of the companies, and their workaround also got included in Rapid7's blog post. So if you cannot get the latest version, yeah. But Juan, have you seen anything else, or Steve, when it comes to remediation?
No, I mean we've got the very basic, which is what we needed, which they fixed it at source, and so we have latest version.
I think it's just all fast. Yesterday we didn't even know it was a vulnerability. Today they're coming out.
Well, as I said, the problem was easily discovered, And so they knew exactly what they had to fix. It wasn't a complicated problem. It was just this slight flaw in the logic. Yeah. But other than moving to latest version, I haven't really looked at any of the workarounds. Right now, I was just looking at how it worked and getting my head around that.
Yeah, this was a cause of an earlier insufficient fix for a 2010 CVE, right? A really old CVE. So they knew exactly where to go and try to implement this. So since this is kind of also implementation dependent, you have to implement it in a certain way in your application to be vulnerable, right? You have to use it. You have to use the request mappings and you have to use a plain old Java object. There's also some things you can do in the implementation to prevent it, right? Which there are some workarounds that are in the official Spring doc that they released. And it's just based on the how you use the data binders and all that, right? The request mappings. So there are some workarounds they published in their official blog. But like Axe mentioned, the best thing you can do is just update, and you don't have to worry about going back and re-implementing all your applications and redeploying. Right?
Yeah.
I find it interesting you mentioned like data binder. I think in Spring's docs, if you look, there was an explicit disclaimer that allowed fields they should be used with data binder, right? And I think the 2010 CV you're referring to, the CV, just I'll spell it out for the audience, CV 2010 1622, I believe that's correct. Yeah, and the Springshell official CVE that's been released today, it's CVE 2022-22965. That is not to be confused with other two CVEs that they release. I will not spell those just to prevent rumors.
Well, thank you for the clarity on that, as well as giving us the specifications to know if you're vulnerable and things to be looking out for. I think my last question for you is, we saw previously with Log4j that it kind of mutated over time. Do we expect to see any of that type of mutation with this vulnerability?
Well, that's a good question. I think what we saw with Log4j was there was lots of confusion as to how damaging it was, under what circumstances you could be compromised, and so people went off in different directions. I hope that's not going to happen here. We've seen the conflating of two vulnerabilities, but I think this particular one is quite straightforward, and the consequences of updating are very, very minimal, because we know exactly what the fix is. It's a small number of lines of code in a very specific place. So I think this should, if people fix, just upgrade to the next version of Spring, I think we should be done with this one. Cross fingers.
That's hopeful thinking. I'm not sure I completely share it, just because even in the Spring advisory, they themselves kind of go ahead and state, that this is very general in the issue. So there could be other ways to exploit it that we're not aware of right now, right? They themselves are coming out and saying it. And the thing now is that since this was mainstream, right, all over Twitter, all over everywhere, it brings researchers' eyes to it, right? So now they're going to be scrutinizing not just the fix, but probably a bunch of other parts of Spring, right? It's going to be in the eyes of all researchers now. So I think that also is the reason why Log4j went on for so long, and it's kind of still going on. So I think it could also potentially happen here, right, with all the attention it's getting.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that we could still see with Log4j is that people are still not fixing it. And we can have a whole long conversation about why people are not applying fixes. And to be honest, with Log4j, there was likely to be sub-dependencies that were needed updated rather than probably customers themselves. With the Spring framework, it's usually much higher up in terms of dependencies, so it's more obvious to people. So again, we can hope that this will be fixed faster than the Log4j one. But I do take your point. People are now going to come back and have a look at this code and see whether they can find other problems. Yeah.
Right. All right, Axe, final thoughts.
Well, I think a member in our audience, Mark, they're saying like it's Springshell is an existing Spring component. It's called Spring4Shell. I've honestly seen both names being used for this vulnerability. Whatever it is, yes, Spring did release an advisory. Please follow the steps in it. Additional information is coming out as we speak. That being said, to what Steve was saying, it's very interesting you mentioned like log4j, because even today, if you go to like Sonatype's log4j dashboard, if you just Google it, like I'm still seeing like about 44% downloads. Even today, they are for vulnerable log4j versions, which is a surprise at this point. It's been months.
All right. Well, you heard it here. Make sure you update, stay up to date. If you want more information on shell spring for log4j, please go to dev.sonatype.com. You can look at our dashboard, see where the downloads are at, and get more information. Till we have more updates, stay tuned.